1814 through 1818. And it was in British West Florida on the Apalachicola River that this settlement was set up with over 3,000 African Americans and Native Americans. Actually, close to 5,000 people lived along the Apalachicola River. And this was where the first battle of the Seminole War began at the site of the Negro Fort. And so I'm trying to work with and get as many people to know about the fort and its history. And I'm honored to be in the presence of such notables as Dr. Simmons and others. And it is my pleasure to hear and see the folks that have been working with this project so long. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Want me to just pass it
Yeah,
on as we go? That might make it easier. Hi, everyone. My name's Ronan Hart. I think everyone here knows me at this point, but I just finished my master's degree in history here at UF, and I'm now, thank you. And I'm coordinating our Underground Railroad Oral History Project grant, the collaboration with the National Park Service and, Mr. Mitchell, and how we've gotten to know a lot of other awesome people and some Quakers so far. And that's what we'll be here to talk about a little bit more in a bit. So just happy everyone can be here to join.
Hi, everyone. I'm Madison. I'm in my undergrad, and I've just started interning through the program, and we're doing some work on the Pensacola project. Nice to meet everyone.
What's your full name, Allison?
It's Madison Matthews.
Madison.
Yes, Madison. You're good.
Hi, my name is Elio Alves. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in history, working on Latin American and Caribbean history. I've been here at SPOHP for a while now, a couple of years, and it's so nice to meet you guys.
What are you doing your work on?
Oh, I work on mostly on Cuban history, late 20th century Cuban history, policy reforms and reversals by the state. Thank you.
Greetings, I'm Sherry DuPree. It's an honor to be here with the people this afternoon. I did work at UF for several years, and from there I worked at Santa Fe and retired. But I did get a chance to go to the Negro Fort when they had the 200-year celebration. Yeah, we took a busload of students there for UNESCO from different parts of Florida. And that was a wonderful ceremony and day. I've been there twice, so I'd like to talk more about that and find out a little more about what you are doing with that. And again, I'm right here in Gainesville, retired.
My name is Agnieszka Idwicka, Aga. I'm from Poland, but this is my second year here at UF in Gainesville. I'm Jewish studies scholar, a specialist in Yiddish language. And here I am curating our SPOHP collection designated for the Jewish studies specifically. But it's actually really great to get to know more about other projects, not just my own hub.
I apologize, but could you just speak a little louder to say what you're doing and your name?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, Agnieszka Idwicka. But everyone knows me Aga, A-G-A, that's easier.
AGA, okay.
Yeah. And I'm specialist in Jewish studies. We're focused on the post-war life, not just in Poland, but globally. And with specialty in Yiddish.
Okay.
Yiddish.
And I'm Deborah, and I work in the archives basically, and just happy to be here.
Well, also, we're trying to get the Saltwater Underground Railroad, which Edward Nichols, who was the lieutenant, he actually was an admiral in the Royal British Marines when he retired. And actually, after leaving the fort on the Apalachicola, he then took them to Trinidad. He went to Trinidad, he went to Cat Island, and he went to Bermuda. And he took the Seminoles there to those three sites. And from there, he eventually became the leader, Edward Nichols, of the when once 1810 came and they stopped the transatlantic slave trade. Edward Nichols ended up becoming and setting up another fort in Cape Verde, on Cape Verde Island.
Oh,
And he was he actually is the founder, and Nichols gave freedom papers to people to come in, like longshoremen and other military who mustered out. His documentation were some of the earliest freedom papers in Florida of free men and landowners who had gotten their royal land, their land as a muster out of the military service for England along that. And those documents are available in the King's, the King of England, King's University in England. Yes.
Wow.
Yes. But we do have the rosters and list of names and individuals that were in there and everything that is now accessible online and on our website.
On your website too.
Yeah, it should be on the INFAC website, I think.
Okay.
Now, we're just building it, so I haven't talked to anyone in the meeting in Apalachicola in the last 30 days. Mm-hmm.
This is amazing. I mean, how many people? I mean, I don't think I even knew the British had a stake in Florida. You know, we hear about the Spanish.
Yes, indeed.
Wow, so they had West Florida, parts of West Florida were colonized by the British.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
I did not know that.
The blacks were going there for safety.
Absolutely.
That's why they went there, because they were being saved by the British to keep them in those islands in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing.
Another great part from in this story is after the court in Apalachicola of Black Seminoles ended up in Southwest Florida and what was called the Angola settlement.
Yes.
And after an attack there, all of them had, a lot of them fled out to the Bahamas, but they're still having for the last few years, every year they're having this big festival there in Bradenton, Florida. We got to go there once. I hope we get to go back out there again.
It's called the Angola settlement?
Yeah, that's what they called it.
Dr. Howard did extensive archaeological work there, and before she passed away just recently in the last year or two.
I know, what a shock that was.
She just passed. Dr. Tenney and members of, I want to say, Bowleg family from the Bahamas. Yeah, the Bowleg family. They came and we met actually in Del Rio, Texas last year with the Muskogos, Negroes, the Seminole Muskogos people. And they had the Bowleg connection even as far west as in Texas. There were Bowlegs, and it was like a family reunion of somewhat, but it had, and I represented the Florida Seminole, the Seminole Freemen. And again, what we were doing and discussing is how the diaspora of the Seminole people from the 1818 up until really reached as far as Mexico. John Horse, he went all the way into Mexico, met with at that time, president, and they were allotted the land which they are still living on in Southwest Texas, Eagle Pass, as well as Del Rio, Texas, and Brackettsville, Texas.
Wow.
So we have brought all those people together, and we're hoping to bring them to the Negro Fort sometime in the upcoming year, 2025. We're scheduling to bring them here, and hopefully we'll be able to have that recorded, and people will be there.
I want to be a part of it.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes. It's like 200 years of our history that really, well, let's say the earliest from 1814 up. This history is documented. We're finding more documentation of it.
Where are you finding your documentation? I'm just curious.
Well, we've been working with a sister out of Trinidad And we've been getting it out of the muster rolls of the Royal British Marines. Yes, the muster rolls of the Royal British Marines list these folks who were, soldiers who literally fought in the War of 1812 and helped with the burning of Washington.
Maybe that's why
Yes.
they don't want to do much publicity about this.
After they helped attack and burn Washington in the Chesapeake Bay region, they went up to Baltimore, of course, Fort McHenry.
Yeah.
And then they mustered out within 2 years of that, and they were given land along the Apalachicola River, which was the east and west dividing line of Florida, East Florida, West Florida. They used that Apalachicola River as the dividing line
Oh my.
with the United States and British West Florida. So, until Andrew Johnson came down, of course,
Oh.
desecrated. He burnt the fort to the ground.
Oh,
They built
my
another
goodness.
site right on top of the fort, which they named Fort Gaston. We had been in a fight to get the Fort Gaston name removed. I mean, literally, they said, we're going to put signage up that says Negro Fort and the history. There's nothing there. All we see are still the signs that call it Fort Gaston and perennial antebellum information.
Did they have the color Fort Gaston?
Well,
That's-
Gadsden was he built the secondary fort.
Yeah, but I just didn't see them ever giving him that. But when I saw those signs up there, you're right, they did have Gaston.
Yeah.
Now-
Every year we try to get them to put at least one sign calling it the Negro Fort.
We need to put the Negro Fort up there. They
Yes,
haven't done so.
yeah. We have to take our banners with us. We actually have banners made for it. But we take them down afterwards and, the park is left and it's
With the Gaston.
with the Fort Gaston notary, so.
And Fort Gaston is still standing.
Well, it is all the same now. It's all because it was built up on it
On
three
top
different
of it.
times. The
Oh.
British built it, then it was rebuilt by Gadsden, and it was a smaller fort than the original fort. So, they have, again, it was also a Confederate Civil War base. And for the longest, they were keeping it as such. Before we
Oh.
celebrated the 200th anniversary, they had a Confederate flag still flying out there. And they did remove that and put the U.S. flag. But the British flag, territorial flag, was out there. And it should stay there. Because this is what it was. It was British territory. And it was actually part of the Commonwealth. Florida was part of the British Commonwealth.
That's amazing history. Woo.
One of my favorite interviews I've got in the Underground Railroad collection is with an artist in Atlanta, Tina Dunkley,
Yes.
who she traces her ancestry to some of the black Marines who served with the British in the War of 1812, who were then mustered out to Trinidad. And then the Trinidadian descendants eventually went back to the United States and lived in New York. And that's where Tina Dunkley grew up. Before discovering this history of, her family's in America and in Trinidad and then back to America.
Her name is
Duncan.
Trina Duncan?
Tina
Tina.
Tina
Dunkley.
Dunkley. And a lot of her art is on that theme. It's really amazing.
Yes. Her father was a longshoreman. And this is how we find more of the military records, or even once they mustered out, they still kept a maritime job or some type of a maritime presence. And even up until the 1830s, 1840s, this is how Frederick Douglass was able to go north on the Underground Railroad, by assuming longshoremen
Right.
ID. And these were all generally people who had become who were Royal British Marines who had become longshoremen. And that passport that the British issued them was the most significant freeman's paper a black person could have to show that they were British citizens and they were able to travel throughout the United States, even in the South. with that British passport
Even during the enslavement period.
during the enslavement period. And Apalachicola was one of the main ports there where they shipped cotton back to Europe from out of that port. And many of those independent families in Apalachicola have that longshoreman background in their families and so forth. You know, so yes, so it's very significant.
Well, to bring it full circle, a lot of the black sailors who were able to escape enslavement that way were working in the whaling industry, especially at New Bedford, that I've been reading about. And a lot of those whaling ships were owned by Quakers. And that's me bringing it full circle.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
So it's
Oh,
all,
my
I
goodness.
just find it fascinating, that's all.
But one other thing too, this is sort of off track, but yes, it's tied in. They said that in South America, they were cutting the trees, and they were cutting the trees and sending the trees all the way up to Apalachicola, Pensacola, all those areas, and they sent it by making these little rafters on the water, and they put those the tree trunk parts together.
Yes.
They put African Americans on those, or people from other cultures, and they would float it all the way here. And I couldn't believe that when they told me that.
Yeah.
Floated it from South America all the way into Pensacola, Apalachicola, all of those areas, and they got some of the best wood that they ever had from South America coming here. That floated. And this was still, we shared that this was in talking to people in June.
Really?
And family members knew about it. And one lady said that her brother had worked on one of those raft units coming to the country.
Yeah.
I wanted to know how long would it take him to do it.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, about 2 or 3 months. I said, well, that's sure, that's down. He said, yeah. He said, the currents were running right, and if the currents were running right, they could bring it right on in.
What era?
This was during the time of the early, about 1846, I believe she said, 1861, around that time span. And it's just that they were bringing it in, and that's how they got special wood that was brought into Florida and moved on up to New York and other places. And I couldn't believe that first, but I believe that they said, because these were people who knew. They had their family and friends who had done it.
In our museum, we have a 40-foot canoe that was carved out of one piece of wood.
Yeah, that's
And we still haven't, I mean, it's in a glass enclosure in our museum, but it came right out of the right out of the Apalachicola River. And it was founded there after one of the big storms came through. You know, we're keeping it in our collection at the museum in Apalachicola. But we also have some information about the people left Apalachicola and settled in Key West.
Yes, they did.
And that Key West connection went all the way from the early 1830s, all the way up until, let's say, Reconstruction period.
I'm gonna get you in contact with Tenny. Tenny's doing,
Dr. Tenney?
yeah, you know Tenny.
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, that's my friend too.
Oh, wonderful. Yes. She has done extensive, and her husband, Gene Tenney, they have done, as a matter of fact, he enlightened me to the connection between those who settled in Key West and came from the Apalachicola region, out of the panhandle of Florida. And they put an early settlement in the early 1838, something like that, they started on. And he gave me a lot of documentation.
He
And
was key for helping.
yes, the Sandy Cornish Trail, and the life of Sandy Cornish as well. Now, he was in St. Marks, Florida, right there in the panhandle where my family's from.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And my family.
And the Indian connection.
And the Indian connection, right.
The Indian connection.
If I could say, I started my research into my mother's family because on the state flag of Florida, there's a woman there on the flag, an Indian woman. Her name is Millie Francis. And I went to FSU asking them to help me research it because I believe that my mother, whose name was Minnie Farmer, the family became farmers because they were in the First Seminole War and they put their weapons down and became farmers instead of warriors. They sent the warrior people out to Oklahoma and Arkansas who continued to fight. And my family, the farmer family, I believe are descendants of Millie Francis, the woman who was on the Florida state flag. And they actually live right in the community that my family is, that I just inherited the land from my mother's family, who have been there over 200 years on the same site.
It's got to have some significance.
Yes, yes, yes. And Millie Francis is, when they keep her on that flag, I'm like, Millie Francis was a Choctaw. She was the daughter of Chief Francis the Prophet. And he was executed at the fort at St. Mark's by Andrew Jackson and his troops.
Goodness.
They executed him, and then they shipped her out. The woman who was on the Florida state flag is buried in Oklahoma. She died in Oklahoma, and they have her at Beacon College. Her body and gravesite is at Beacon College.
Yeah.
In Oklahoma.
In Oklahoma, yes.
Which just I was looking at Beacon College because you talked about that in the transcript. They just lost their accreditation. It's unclear what's even going to happen in
Yes.
college at this point.
Yes, yes, yes.
So many of these small schools are going under, you know.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, that's
And this was the first, Beacon College was actually the first Native American HBCU, land grant college. So it's an HBCU too, because it was a
Oh,
land grant
wow. I
college.
didn't realize
Well,
that.
I hate to interrupt. I know we could
Okay.
do this for a couple more hours.
Yes, I'm sorry. Go
But
No,
Dr.
no.
Simmons, if you're ready, I'd love to ask you a couple questions.
Okay, if I can turn my attention away from
Yeah.
all this information that I'm learning, because I am totally unaware of this incredible history. My goodness. Okay, hopefully I
Okay,
can.
yeah, if we can move like 150 years forward.
150 years forward?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
So I figure we're going to be talking about the American Friends Service Committee a bit, but before that, when I was reading the Dan Berger book, I saw that you at Spelman had a professor who was a Quaker also, Stoughton
yeah.
Lund. Could you say anything about your impression of him or how he represented like Quaker ideas?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for that wonderful question, because Stoughton Lund, who was a Quaker and a professor and a friend, a dearly beloved mentor and friend, who passed away, I believe, a couple of years ago. When I got to Spelman College in 1962, I don't even know how I got into an experimental class that had not been taught in this way before. It was a combination of American history, and it really was Black history, but at that point they and it is American history, of course it is, but I didn't realize it was going to have so much African American history content. But anyway, it was a literature and American history class combined. And Stoughton Lund, who was the history professor, and a woman from New York who was Jewish, and hopefully her name will come back to me in a minute. She was the English teacher or the literature teacher. And coming from Memphis, Tennessee, and having been raised in the Jim Crow South in the segregated schools, I had never had a white teacher. So to go into this class that I was assigned to and to have two white teachers was a bit startling, and I was like, oh my God, what's this going to be like? And as it turned out, I learned so much in that class, and not only was Stoughton Lund my teacher, but he became my friend. And he was what I learned over many, many years was the epitome of Quaker, of what a Quaker is if they are living up to Quaker ideals. And he taught really African American history as the integral part of American history that it is. And I learned things that I knew nothing about, and was as amazed as I am sitting here now learning about the Negro Fort in Apalachicola, and all that we've talked about for the last few minutes. But he was not only a teacher, he was an activist, a peace activist, and a civil rights activist, and very connected to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he encouraged me to get involved in the movement. And of course, this was against Spelman's rules, because in freshman orientation, they had told us if we got involved in the civil rights movement, particularly those of us who were there on on scholarship, that we could lose our scholarships and be thrown out. And of course, the only reason that I was there was because I had a scholarship, full scholarship. And so I was terrified of breaking those rules and losing it. But Staunton Lynn encouraged me to get involved, and it was through him that I learned about the freedom schools that were going to be a part of Mississippi Freedom Summer. And after taking the year-long class with him on American history, that was the other thing. It was a 2-semester class, which meant that I got to spend the first full year at Spelman with him and Esther Seaton, that's her name, thank goodness it came back, and reading, W.B. Du Bois and so many others whom I had never heard of, Baldwin, and oh my goodness, so many of the the Harlem Renaissance writers and all. So this was an amazing and eye-opening part of my first year in college. And as I mentioned, Staunton Lynn and I remained friends until his death. Maybe it was 2 years ago at the most, and I think he was 96. But through him, I also I was introduced to Quaker meetings, and the Quaker Meeting House in Atlanta was one of the few integrated places in Atlanta, Georgia at that time. And many of the meetings were held in the Quaker Meeting House about civil rights. Of course, it was so funny when I heard that he was a Quaker, and the only time I'd ever heard that word before was on the Quaker oats. And I was saying, well, you're not dressed like a Quaker, And so, of course, that's how ignorant I was of the movement and how it had evolved over the centuries that it had been here in the United States. So, as I said, Staunton introduced me to so much African American history and true American history, as well as the Quaker movement and the Quaker Meeting House and the whole idea of sitting in silence for worship, which just was strange to me. I kept saying, you mean nobody's going to say anything? And he said, only if the Spirit moves you. So no choir, no minister, sitting in silence. That was shocking to me because I'd been brought up a Baptist. So the whole idea of silent worship was something that I was introduced to through Staunton and the Quakers.
Awesome.
Okay.
So for Staunton and the other Quakers that you met, how did they understand the relationship between their faith and the organization and the movement, the Black freedom struggle? How did they what was that connection for them?
Well, that's an interesting question. They were not proselytizers, so it took some pretty much learning the history of the Quaker movement from England and coming from England to the U.S. And learning some of their philosophy and thoughts and all came later. But of course, what I realized was that one of their main tenets, which was walk softly on the land, recognizing that of God in everyone. And I learned that later, not directly from him, but I would say those whom I met lived according to that, that they recognized that of God in everyone. And therefore you had to treat everyone with equality.
Mm-hmm. But that's a big jump from treating everyone with equality to like being in the movement and being like a place where people meet to organize and put all this together.
Well, it seemed to me that they thought you should put your belief into action. And so if you're living in an unjust society where people are not being treated justly with equality, then it's your duty to be a part of a movement that changes that. That's what I saw from all the Quakers that I've worked with, later when I went to work at the American Friends Service Committee and worked with them for 23 years. And that, not that everybody lived up to it, but certainly that was the guiding principles that I think got them involved in the abolitionist movement, in the Underground Railroad, in the civil rights movement. They were on the front lines of these movements. And so that was the thing that guided them.
Do you want to talk about the American Friends Service Committee, how you got involved in that and your role?
Interestingly, of course, as I've said, I learned about the Quakers during my time at Spelman. I, spent time at the Quaker Meeting House. But when I moved to Philadelphia, I was married to Michael Simmons, and we had begun working on anti-draft work in the Atlanta project of SNCC. And it was trying to organize in the Black community against the draft and against the war in Vietnam. And of course, the Quakers were very big in the peace movement. And in Atlanta, when I came back to Atlanta after working in Mississippi, the Friends meeting was a place where many of us who were opposed to the war in Vietnam would hold our meetings. And Michael Simmons, who was a SNCC worker whom I met and we married, he got his induction notice to report to the draft, and he refused to go. And as a result of that, we had several major demonstrations in front of the induction center there in Atlanta. Michael and many of the other SNCC workers were jailed. And of course, as a result of that, in addition to being sentenced to 6 months at hard labor at the penal farm there in Georgia, he was also indicted by the federal government for refusing to go to Vietnam, or, submitting to the draft. So, yeah, so many people. And he was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Well, he was out on bond and working its way through the courts with SNCC-appointed lawyers. And we had moved to Philadelphia because it became clear that he was going to have to do the time. And he wanted, being from Philadelphia, he wanted to go to a federal prison as close to Philadelphia as possible. So that was the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. Once he was in the penitentiary, I got a letter from the Friends, not the AFSC at that point, but it was like almost a secret organization, it seemed to me, because I had never heard of them. And they wrote to tell me that they had prison visitors. And these were Quaker people who made it their business to visit with people in prisons to help them in any way that they could and to help their families. So, of course, I said, absolutely. We had a daughter, who was only 3 months old when he began serving his prison sentence. And the prison visitor was a person named Honey Knopp. I would meet her when I would go to visit him in prison because she would be making her rounds. And again, she was very connected to the American Friends Service Committee. And so she introduced me to the AFSC. And I began to volunteer with them and also got involved in their peace education work. So that's how it began. And then later, when they had a position, I was told about it by another SNCC worker who was working for them, Ed Nakawatasi, the first Japanese American I'd ever met, who was a SNCC staff person. And it's, let me just digress for a moment. When I first went to the SNCC office in 1963, I met Ed Nakawatase there. And he and a man named Tom Wakayama were on the staff. Well, again, when you grow up not aware of all the other racial groups, I thought they were Chinese because I'd never knew the distinction. So I actually went up to them and said, "You guys are in the movement?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, why are Chinese in the civil rights movement?" And they said, "Well, first of all, we're not Chinese, we're Japanese." I was so embarrassed. And then they went on to say that their parents had been in the camps, the internment camps, which I knew nothing about. And I said, "Internment camps? What are you talking about?" And they went on to tell me. And I said, "That couldn't have happened here." They said it did. So anyway, we remained friends forever also. And Ed Nakawatase told me when I was volunteering that AFSC had a position and he thought I ought to apply. And the position was to be the assistant project director in something called the Project on Government Surveillance and Citizens' Rights. And I applied and I got the job. And I stayed with them for 23 years.
Wow. Yeah. What's the working environment like with in a Quaker office? What's the difference between that and SNCC,
Money. No. There was a saying that was not often very nice. They said, "The Quakers came to do good and they did well." So, there's a lot of wealth in the Quaker community. And the AFSC in Philadelphia was their international headquarters. And they had, 10 regional offices and something like 23 field offices. And the AFSC in Philadelphia was the national or international headquarters. In addition, they had the UN office in New York, and they had the Washington lobbying office in DC. So it was a pretty large organization. And I think at one point, maybe like 23, 25 million a year. So, SNCC was hand-to-mouth kind of organization with Jim Foreman begging, being the main fundraiser. He was the executive secretary, but he was also the main fundraiser, constantly trying to make payroll, every month for the organization. But it was much, as wealthy and well organized and quite a a building, sitting right there in the heart of downtown Philadelphia. You could see, as they called him, Billy Penn, a statue, which was across the street atop the city hall. And there was the Friends School that was K through 12, which was quite close by. And there was the Quaker Meeting House attached to the AFSC offices. And then they had another meeting house in Philadelphia that went back to the 1700s. So, it was quite a difference in the organization. And it was a majority white organization. They did work to their credit to integrate, because there are not many Black Quakers. So by the time that I was hired, there was something called the Third World Coalition as a part of AFSC, and through it, the number of Black and brown and others of color working there expanded a lot in my 23 years there. And of course, it had programs working on everything from Native American programs. In fact, Ed Nakawatase headed up the Native American program, interestingly. It had many programs with Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, many programs on peace and disarmament. And so it was a large organization with lots going on. So it was exciting, to work there. There were the internal education of bringing all these people together was often quite, we used to have staff meetings that would go on for hours where, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricanos, African Americans, white Americans, Quakers, some non-Quakers, really struggling over issues of how to move forward to bring about the social change that we knew was needed in this country. So it was exciting, it was wonderful, it was combative, it was an incredible experience.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask about next, is like that process of coalition building and getting all these people to work together, because of course you have the Quaker dedication to nonviolence is huge, but then at the same time you have people starting to think about decolonization and revolutionary violence and these things. How do you make all those people work together in this? Did you?
Well, the organization is still standing.
Okay.
So that shows you, even though, it did in that, 2008 financial downturn, it was hit pretty hard financially in terms of its investments and all of that. But, like I said, sometimes it could be very combative, and the whole issue of nonviolence was often challenged, because I failed to mention that AFSC had programs in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. So these, the staff from the international programs would come in for major meetings and things. And the whole issue of nonviolence was often debated, and, the Quakers were saying, well, this is our creed. But at the same time, there was understanding, there were people from ANC who were living in exile, who were on AFSC's staff. And so the ANC had a military wing. You had people from Nicaragua. You had people from Cuba, because they had programs in Nicaragua and in Cuba, Mozambique. So there was kind of some uneasy, what can I say, recognition that in some cases, people in countries where the only way to bring about change, they had agreed amongst themselves, was through violent revolution. AFSC was able to say, well, our program officers cannot be heading up the military wings, but at the same time, we cannot condemn. So it was an uneasy coalition in many ways.
I find that so interesting because it's so similar to the abolitionist coalition when you did have Quakers and other like more moderate white abolitionists, and then the wing of John Brown and lots of like radical black abolitionists who were more interested in violence. And we had one interview that I wasn't there for, but I was listening through it with two people who were descendants of Quakers who lived around the Philadelphia area, whose ancestor was involved in the Christiana resistance.
Oh, yeah.
One of them. And in the course of this interview, one of Gabrielle, one of our interviewers, mentions John Brown, and one of the narrators, like an older guy, kind of scoffs, and he says, like, John Brown was not an abolitionist. And that, like, totally stuck out to me.
Wow.
What was he?
Yeah, that would be the question, right? So I don't know, and that just really left me wondering, like, how are you a part of this movement and kind of reckon with, the part of it that really did end slavery, by the end of it. So, but I'm curious about that also. Like, did the Quakers talk about their history? Did they talk about abolitionism or the?
You mean
Railroad?
in the organization itself?
Yeah, in the organization or the meetings or anything.
Not a lot, because we were all in the, in the thick of whatever movements were happening at the time,
Busy.
and so busy. And, people, I think the non-Quakers probably outnumbered the number of Quakers actually working in AFSC. Mm-hmm. So it was never sort of an effort to proselytize you to the Quaker religion or Quaker beliefs. And some friends, I think, found that disturbing, people who weren't on the staff. But Quakers, because the board was always Quaker. And so the board meetings would often become sites of contestation around the issues of what AFSC could support or should support as a Quaker organization and what it could not support. So it was always quite a raucous place during meetings and with AFSC attempting to be, conscious of differences and respectful of differences of opinion. But it was difficult. Mm-hmm. It wasn't easy.
Maybe outside of the committee or just living in Philadelphia with all of the Quaker influence and Quaker stuff everywhere, is that history, like the abolitionist history, remembered very much, like in that, in the statues and public history and when the Quakers are telling their story, is abolitionism part of it? I guess is my question.
I think it's not nearly enough. I mean, I lived there for 30 years in Philadelphia, and, my daughter went to friends' schools. So, of course, she was steeped in it. Yeah. But, and the friends have a number of high schools and middle schools and elementary, because most of their schools go from K through 12th grade. And then you have Swarthmore College, Quaker school, Bryn Mawr College, a Quaker school, Haverford College, a Quaker school. Oh, yeah. But I didn't feel that a lot of people were really even aware of this incredible history, because the Quakers went about their work sort of quietly, And AFSC was the place where people could hold their meetings, because it was open till the building till 10 o'clock at night. So many of the organizations, movement organizations held their meetings there. And they were free of charge, that you could meet in the many rooms and conference rooms and things there. So the Friends availed themselves of their spaces for people to be able. But there wasn't a lot of, I think, awareness of this history. I mean, everybody knew William Penn was on City Hall there, but I don't even know if they knew who he was, you know, or the role that he had played in early America.
Okay. Well, I guess that's why the project is important.
It is.
So everyone can know about it.
Yeah.
They're very modest people.
Very modest, yeah.
So I'd love to open this up if anyone else has questions about this or just any other questions for Dr. Simmons while we're here. Unless that's too broad.
No, I'm happy. I don't think I know a lot. That's the problem. But anyway.
It makes sense to me then that Philadelphia becomes the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad due to the support of the Quakers and the movement that the Friends Society created. And I always wondered why the heads of the Underground Railroad, such as William Lloyd Garrison and others, all seemed to find Philadelphia as their hub. Even I forgot the brother's name who was like the conductor general out of Philadelphia.
William Still, yes,
now
indeed.
It makes more sense to me that the backing of the Quakers and the Friends Society at large had a lot to do with it. And it even, now I wanted to also know, when did Martin Luther or the Lutheran movement come into the mindset of the Quaker people, or were they unilateral?
You mean over in Europe?
Yes, when they over in Europe, right? When that came, did that become part of the?
Well, you know, the Quakers were heretical for the Christians in Europe, and in fact, many of them fled
seeking religious freedom.
Yeah, seeking religious freedom. But one thing that and I haven't done any deep research on this, but one of the things, George Fox is considered the founder of Quakerism. But I never heard this from Quakers, but I was attending a conference and there were people there who began to tell me that George Fox had been around Sufis, Sufi Muslims, and that this was the beginning of his turn toward mysticism. Because for many, the Quakers were considered mystics, mystic Christians. And I wondered, and this was a Spanish person who told me this, who was a Quaker that I met at this conference. And I did do a little looking up, and I did find that George Fox had been around Muslims. See, this would be the 16th century, you know, who had come into Europe who were Sufis. But I don't have any proof that this is true. But this was interesting that this group of Christians used this form of worship, you know, which is silent meditation. But they, in front of the American Friends Service Committee building is a statue of a woman who was hanged because of her beliefs. So she sits in repose right at the entrance to the American Friends Service. It's called Friends Center because it's not only the AFSC's offices, but you have a Quaker meeting house there and other offices of Friends in what's called Friends Center at 15th and Cherry. So the first thing you see when you enter is a woman who was hanged for her religious beliefs. But that's, I also didn't know until much, much later that there was a sizable Black Quaker community in Philadelphia. But many, in the 1800s, because there are certainly Black Quakers now, but they are not descendants of those early Black Quakers who had converted to
Would they
Quakers.
be related to any of the Mother Bethel AME Church or any of the
Well,
other
that's an
Philadelphia?
interesting
Would they
thing
have
because
come?
that's a very interesting, because of course Mother Bethel, that's the offshoot from the Methodists.
Yes.
When they formed their own separate community after being treated so harshly, by the white Methodists, and then they decided we're not going to put up with, having to sit in the back, and then if in fact the seats are needed, we had to get up and go outside and listen through the windows, and that's when they said this is enough, and
They didn't have segregated church services or areas like this.
No, they were inside the churches, but in the back. They had to sit in the back. And then if the seats were needed, they had to get up and give their seats to the white parishioners and stand outside. And that's when, what's his name, the founder of the AMEs, Allen.
Yes.
Yes, they walked out. They said, we're not taking this anymore, and formed their own. Wasn't called initially, I'm trying to remember what was the initial name of the group that then became the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They initially started another group before they renamed.
United Methodist, is that when they
No.
United Methodist?
They separated, but when they separated, they had another name for themselves. I can't remember it before they took the name African American Methodist Episcopal. But I don't think they were connected to the Quakers.
I remember hearing a story that they had the Great Day of Pentecost in the United States back in the 1700s,
Oh,
maybe
yes.
the early 1700s,
Yes,
and that the effect on slavery
yes,
was a byproduct of this Great Day of Pentecost that came through
exactly.
every segment of religious America.
Yes,
And it took place on the eastern shore of Maryland, and that happens to be where we get our Underground Railroad iconic class of Frederick Douglass
yes.
and Harriet Tubman
right.
and others, even Sandy Cornish, also came from the eastern shore of Maryland.
Okay.
And they said that, and I, of course, none of us were there, but they said that it was a great light that came over all of the country,
Yes.
On that day of Pentecost.
Right.
And that it was what formulated the Underground Railroad, or the fact that
Gave
anti-slavery movement was not a Christian or religious,
Yes.
they weren't going to support it any further at that point. And that's where we see our churches develop, such
Yes.
as, becoming the strongholds of the AME and Richard Allen.
Yeah.
And he actually even was involved in that day of
Pentecost. Yes.
which took place. But it was more so in the white community. The white churches even dispelled their, I guess the Southern Baptist religion wasn't even a religion yet, known as Southern Baptist churches.
No.
But it evolved from that because they wanted to keep all humans as equal and not enslaved or not chattel. And that was one of the big pretenses of the Quaker Church, and it was something else, the Quakers and the Shakers or something like that.
There's another
group that
Shakers,
came
the
from
Mennonites.
The Mennonites and all of them
Yes.
evolved from this day of Pentecost
Yes.
and got into their own sects, including the Brigham Young and the what are they called?
Mennonite.
Mormons.
Mormons.
Yes, the Mormons of New York. They leave from New York and go out to Utah. All of this comes from this epoch of the great day of Pentecost, and even though we have, and black people at that point in time were not allowed to read or even read scripture or share scripture amongst themselves as black people, and so it became something significant for other groups like the Quakers and others to stand for human dignity at that point. For every human had to be given his dignity. And I just haven't heard much of that, and I don't know exactly what date that was, but I know there was supposed to be a great epiphany over the whole country within the religious right. Many who came over here for religious freedom.
They came from Europe.
Yes, they came from Europe. They all had to merge into a human dignity phase of religion, and they opened their churches and things to us. To blacks who were enslaved, and they wanted to get them out of the South where they were being farmed and being used as
chattel.
Chattel in the way that they were raising them, having slave farms and things of that nature. And it thwarted a lot of that.
And I don't know if you recall, Sherry, but as I think that it came with the Methodists from Europe. And then you had the great Pentecost, not Pentecost.
Yes.
And I'm trying to remember because, I used to know a little bit about this history, but I'm trying to remember it did for a while sweep over the land, but I can't remember what caused them to change, because in the South, the Methodists were segregated, so something thwarted that sort of equilibrium or equality thrust that had come with the Methodists from Europe. But I don't quite recall.
John Wesley was tied in with that.
Yes.
John Wesley out of England. Yeah.
The Wesley
Methodist
movement.
Church, like you were saying. But I was sitting here thinking too as to what was the big step. I don't remember that right offhand. I'm sitting here just checking right.
Yeah, I was about to say, because something, in fact, many, the so-called Christians that had initially founded the country, well, there's some who say they were not Christians anyway. But if we're talking about the early settlers and the kind of Christianity, I think they were, Lutheran mainly?
No, they were the Anglican Church.
Anglican Church.
Anglican Church.
But they also had their dissenters, Presbyterians.
Yes.
Yeah.
They did have their other groups who.
Because it was only
Massachusetts.
after the Great Pentecost did African Americans really convert to Christianity. That brought them into the Christian movement. I mean, they may have been on the outskirts, but they didn't go for it until they saw people shouting and overcome with the Spirit. And they could relate to that because of African traditional religions, the whole notion of the Spirit coming into you, which they knew from African traditional religions, drew them to the Christian movement in a way that they'd never been before. But it's something that the Southerners were able to get the Methodists to go along with slavery, because something...
Well, Florida is also unique in that because Catholicism was used by the Spaniards
Right.
and introduced to the African American segment because it was a requirement that they embrace
Exactly. If you became Catholic.
Catholicism. Yes, you embrace Catholicism, and then you could be considered a free subject of Spanish Florida.
Exactly.
But even more so when they embraced it, it evolved further into when they wanted to do missionary work with the natives, they then wanted to put a perspective of, I'm going to say the Baptist church or the Baptist practice as a separate than the Catholicism practice. And it rooted us as Southern Baptists or African Americans in Florida to have a religious orientation, unlike any other state of the first 13 colonies or of the period of time during that time. So that we had our own religious freedom in Florida that allowed us to baptize, to bring the Southern Baptist movement of you had to baptize your child when they were born, before they were dead and all that. In Florida, when you came in, and most African Americans who came from like Georgia, who were new, who had just come into the country by way of slave ships, they wanted to kind of embrace it because it allowed their Yoruba or their other traditions to come in when they came to Florida to practice it. And I think that we didn't have structured churches at that time. We were using outdoor bush arbors and other areas, and we were outlawed from gathering once it became part of the United States.
Right.
We could not have these, religious
Not to mention
gatherings.
reading the Bible itself, because the reading was
reading
a
the
lot.
Bible, right?
Yeah.
But we do know that in Spanish Florida, the Latin Bible was in the hands of black ministers. We do know that. We know that from St. Augustine at Fort Mose. We know that from even the Caribbean islands of Cuba and others, that they had already fostered their own brand of, I'll say, Baptist religion, but it was more so rooted in its African, and so with the Latin American experience, as well, the Latin Bible, the Latin, and I don't want to say it was all Spaniards. It was more so, the early Christian movement of the Catholic Church under St. Augustine, which the city of St. Augustine is named. He was black.
Oh.
St. Augustine was a Moroccan.
Oh, yes.
His
You
mother
mean
was
the
from
real
Morocco.
St. Augustine? Yes.
Yes, real St.
Okay,
Augustine.
indeed.
So, and it was in his vision and view
Yes.
that they got rid of the Christ on the cross and they went into the ox head cross under the guidance of St. Augustine, that they decided to use the Egyptian ox head as a symbol of the risen Christ and not the Christ on the cross in sacrifice. And that's how he became beatified and became a saint, as well as an African. That's why I let everybody know St. Augustine, Florida is named after a black man, an African descendant.
Yeah.
And it's probably the only city in the whole nation that's named and been named, and the oldest city to be named after this, Catholic Pope. And it was about...
And most people don't even know he was an African.
Yes. Yes. No, most people don't.
They don't know.
No, they don't know that he was African.
One question that I am kind of left with about Quakers and Underground Railroad is that of course, among the white abolitionists, the Quakers were very early and really significant in it, but there were still lots of other white denominations that the abolitionists were coming from. You have all the Methodists and Unitarians and Baptists and Presbyterians, and their ministers were also very significant as conductors and everything. But going past that into the 20th century, it seems like it was really mostly just the Quakers who kind of stuck to having an interest in Black freedom struggle and that kind of progressive political interests, whereas these other denominations that had that interest in some way and participated in it kind of lost that. And I think, I can come up with answers for why the other denominations lost it, but why did the Quakers stick with it? How did the Quakers stay as radical as they did for as long as they did compared to other groups? If that's possible to answer, I don't know. That's just one.
Well, I certainly can't answer it. I was thinking that, it would have been good to have had a Quaker person here. We have the Quaker meeting
In Gainesville.
here in Gainesville, and that's a place where the Jewish Voices for Peace, we meet there. And, they open their doors to still radical or progressive movements. And I think that for many Quakers, they really do hold to what they call their testimonies. Have you done any research into the testimonies of friends? That's
so.
Oh, look into that, because that's a big thing, that they have a set of testimonies that Quakers are to live by. And I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but for instance, once the Friends decided that they were against slavery, they made all of the Quakers sell their slaves. I mean, and if you didn't, you would be put out of the meeting. So, it's like once they decided that this is wrong and we're opposed to it, then everybody had to live accordingly. And what I've found just being around Friends is, that the belief structure for many suggests to them that you must live accordingly. And so I think that the whole notion of words into deeds means something. Now, whether or not that's, many Quakers children go to Friends schools, and so they're certainly taught that in school. I think that helps immensely. And so they have this liberal or progressive ideology taught in their Sunday schools also. I think that has a big part to do with it.
We do need to talk to some Gainesville Quakers,
That'd
I
be
think.
great.
Yeah.
But they don't say anything.
Well, they talk plenty outside of the meeting for worship. The meeting for worship is a totally different thing, but they would be happy, I'm sure, to, and I can get you some names of Friends.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, okay.
It's interesting, too, to note that the geopolitical strife of the Civil War really took place near Germantown, Gettysburg, and in those areas.
Yes.
It's interesting to note that was...
That's a very good point, isn't it?
There was a lot of
thought of
violence from some branches of somewhere up in that region. I don't know how that,
Well, that's something the Quakers that we had interviewed in Pennsylvania talked about, that they were not treated well, of course, by the Southern armies that came up or the Northern Army, the Union as it came down, because I think they said there was an element of blame a little bit towards the Quakers that were known for the abolitionism coming from the Union Army. But also, of course, when the Quakers living in the South, for the Union troops that came down, they didn't really see the difference. And they're treated the same.
So the Union Army treated them badly?
I need to
That's
listen to this. I
interesting.
need to listen to this interview again to double check that. But that's what I remember them saying.
Like you're the cause of the Civil War?
That was a.
That's interesting.
Don't quote me
No,
on this.
no,
I'm gonna
I
have to
want-
listen to it again to make sure that's
That's
what they said. But that's what I
interesting.
remember.
And how do they differ, the Quakers differ from Mormonism? And that?
Oh, that's a big difference. Well, the early Mormons, had blacks in the early part of the
Really?
Mormons. But then, that's another thing that I never really studied the Mormons, but I'm so mad at myself that I can't remember what happened to the Methodists who went south and, threw off their early beliefs and began to be slave owners and to support the slavocracy. But there was a real turn for the, for the Methodists. But the Mormons, unfortunately began to suggest that blacks and Native Americans were not human beings.
Yeah, we're inferior.
Yeah, a different order of creation even. That they were not from the original creation of Adam and Eve, that they are a lower creation, which was quite a change from the early Mormon teachings when there were blacks as a part of the early Mormons.
The Bible has to, it's rooted in Africa, so why would it not be translated?
Well, they have their own. The Mormons have their own Bible,
Yes.
Yeah. So.
I understand the Mormons actually pray for the souls of the dead.
Well, that's a
throughout, I've gone to Utah to do some research in their genealogical life.
Well, they are the great genealogists.
And yes, and the reason that they are so is because when a person dies,
you pray for them.
You pray for their deliverance and souls into the afterlife.
Yes.
And they have been recording that.
Yes, which is
from
interesting.
Everyone who passes, not just their own Mormon sect, but from everyone where they're located, their chapters are located.
Yeah, they are quite genealogists. And a lot of the people who are now looking into the genealogy, have drawn from their files.
Yes, OGS, the African American Genealogical and Historical Society,
draws on them.
Yeah, I went up there with a trip from.
Oh,
them.
really?
They went to Utah. My brother is president of the Central Florida OGS group here, and so he says, "Oh man, we're going to go up there."
Gee whiz! And so you guys are busy.
I'm not religious though. You
guys are busy.
I'm not. Big on religion, and I gotta quit saying that here in Florida.
No, that's cool.
But yeah,
religions have done some bad things.
Yeah, I think we've hurt ourselves sometime turning the other cheek and using that scripture. So I just know that the Mormons have such a significant library of genealogy and so
That's
forth.
what I hear.
And it's something that if you join OGS, I think they go at least once a year.
Oh my goodness, I didn't even know about OGS.
Yes, and they're having their conference in October, the African American Genealogical and Historical Society, their national conference, and.
Where will it be?
I have to ask my brother where it's going to be. I want to say Richmond, but I think that's where it was last year, and they may not go back to Richmond. But that is a good group in Florida. The Central Florida chapter is very great, and the Tallahassee chapter. They have.
Is Central the one? Is it in Orlando?
Orlando,
okay.
Yes, and it meets at the Orlando Library, and they are piecing together the African American history, but it has its limitations because they didn't record a lot of us. But since I've been doing the research at Negro Fort, my brothers and their group has started, logging a lot of the names and information of people who went to the outer islands, Trinidad, Cat Islands. And many of those people have come back and are now living back, like Tina Dunkley and her family.
So
they're back
amazing.
in the United States. You think about the names of even some of our great radicals who came from these outer islands during the SNCC movement. What's the brother's name?
Stokely Carmichael.
Yes,
from Trinidad.
Trinidad.
Yes, indeed.
And he was right there in the heart of it, out there in Lowndes County.
Lowndes County, Alabama. Yeah. Well, he was first in Mississippi.
Yes,
I worked with him in Mississippi. Yes. That's so interesting because the only group that I had known of that the British took out of the country who had supported them and took them to Canada. So I didn't even know about groups that had been taken to Trinidad and the Bahamas.
The ones who went to Canada must have been so mad when their friends got to go down to a tropical island, and they're like, no, Nova Scotia, have fun fishing.
And you know, we did have a professor here who did a lot of research on the African Americans taken to Nova Scotia. She's no.
Edward Nichols, actually,
What's her
who left the
name?
Negro Fort, went to Nova Scotia.
She was head of
You know,
African
before he made it
American
back to
Studies
England.
for maybe
His
2
last
years.
trip was to Nova Scotia, and he, of course, left people there.
God, I almost
Brought
called
that
her
came
name.
from Florida.
She
They ended up in
retired,
Nova
and
Scotia.
she's up in North Carolina. Still have her number and stuff, but I don't think that would have had anything to do with the Underground Railroad. That was because the British did take the Africans out of the United States who had fought with them
Yes.
Yeah.
in the
After 1812.
yeah.
Even those who fought in Tangiers, you know, when they fought against Spain, the British defeated the Spaniards on the sea. They had black regiments involved
From the
on
US?
maritime. Yes.
Oh my God, I had no
Yes.
idea.
They had already went out to what is the name of that? I want to say not Gibraltar, but the British has the big ark in there named after the general the admiral who won that battle out there. But wow.
Yeah,
It's not Gibraltar.
Trafalgar, thank
was
you,
the
Trafalgar.
battle. Nelson. Yeah,
Nelson,
Admiral
yes. The
Nelson.
battle in Trafalgar had black troops who they brought back and
Oh my God.
gave them British territory land as their muster. They didn't want to go to Jamaica or any of those islands because they still had some form of
Connection.
racism or I'm not. I mean, slavery was still kind of.
yeah.
You know, they were still bringing in slaves and dropping them off, and then
Yeah.
still exporting them elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so these blacks who had already fought for the Royal British Marines wanted to make sure they were on their own land, soil that they owned, and that's how they ended up on the Apalachicola River.
This is amazing. Antioch is
The
in.
black, I mean, it's an HBCU, it's not
Oh,
Oberlin.
Wilberforce.
Wilberforce,
Thank you.
yeah.
And William Wilberforce, of course,
Yes.
was an abolitionist.
Yes, he was,
And
definitely.
I also heard that Wilberforce was also one of the co-writers of Amazing Grace, the song Amazing Grace.
No, that was John Newton and William Cooper, and I've written a lot about William Cooper. I know all about that guy. So yeah.
Amazing Grace, he was the person who repented for having been in part of the
And
slave
the Oldie
trade.
Hymns was their kind of collaborative full book of hymns, but Cooper wrote a lot of other poems, and he was very early in the anti-slavery movement
Okay.
as kind of their poet.
And what's his name?
William Cooper, but spelled like Cowper, like
Oh, right.
Cowper.
Right,
So
right.
I find him really fascinating
I do too.
on his own. Yeah.
I had researched that song when I was at Howard.
There's so much history that has not been. I was going to suggest, have you all tried to get Spike Lee interested in your story?
I haven't personally, but I know that Dr. Tolliver he's a professor or trustee up at New York City College. I'm trying to remember the name of the college, but anyway, he has mentioned that he has reached out to a couple of people about the story.
Yeah, this is a movie making enterprise. Let me tell you.
Someone is making a movie about the Second Seminole War. I got an ad for it on Instagram.
Oh yeah,
Right
that's
there.
Dr. Dixon, Anthony Dixon.
Okay.
Oh, is Anthony Dixon
Dr.
making it?
Dixon and
The Second Seminole War?
Mm-hmm.
Really? Wow.
Dixon and I have been researching this for quite a long time, since
that's
the
fantastic.
2015. As a matter of fact, he had a lot to do with having that first 200th anniversary program at Negro Fort. Yeah, and he's now at Bethune-Cookman.
That's right.
Oh, is he teaching there now?
Yes.
That's
Yes,
great.
I think he's on sabbatical right now because of the movie or whatever that he is producing, and
So he's gotten the money to actually begin filming and everything?
yes. Interesting enough, in Tallahassee, I've been working with Dr. Natalie King Pedrosa, And Dr. Pedrosa, she is involved with these in New Orleans, in Louisiana right now, with these two sisters who just brought a plantation where her descendants were slaves. And they are turning it into a field school, a field education school in Louisiana.
Like archaeology?
Yeah, archaeology, genealogy. It's going to have a multifaceted curriculum that graduate and undergraduate studies. And she and Dr. Dixon both are no longer at FAMU, but at their prospective schools. And they have, matter of fact, they actually have, what's the guy who did Color Purple? The white guy who was in.
The first.
It's not Steven Spielberg.
Oh.
It's one of those big names.
Yeah.
Well, Spielberg did the original Color Purple.
Oh, well, then it is Steven. Well, then, yeah, they're working right now with him on putting together this project in Louisiana to then focus on the Negro Fort. So I think that's where he's getting his
Keep
money.
talking. We're going to start cleaning up.
Oh, well.
Please keep talking if you don't. I can take your plate if you want.